Hi, Jim Walsh here for Town Square Media with James Wolner. James, you've got a new podcast for us to talk about here. Tell us about it.
Well, this is a 7-part series I put together. I worked really hard on over the last 7 months. It's basically a true crime documentary about Wade and Ellen Zick, who were murdered, sadly and tragically, in 1976 in the little rural town of Zeeland, North Dakota, way down there by the South Dakota border in McIntosh County. And it's a very tragic story, but it was really time for this story to be told, and I worked really hard on it. And it's now available as a podcast, as I said, in 7 parts, and I've got really some great feedback on it.
Now, there have been stories like this, of course, that have come out over the last 40, 50 years. What in your mind stands out about this one? What prompted you, motivated you to cover this particular case?
Yeah, so a couple things about it. One was, I keep telling people, is when I read about this, I came across it kind of by accident. Read an old newspaper article, and I thought, I've never heard of this. What is this? And I immediately thought of Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood, about a quadruple murder down in Kansas, I believe, in the 50s or early 60s.
Right.
And I thought, for me, this is as compelling a story and heartbreaking as that one. And part of it, had to do with Wade Zick, who and his wife. They were in their mid-60s. He was very involved in the church, very religious man, very involved in the Lutheran Church. And sort of the way this whole story started, as far as the community of Zeeland understanding that something was amiss, was when their choir director and organist, Wade, didn't show up for church on July 11th, 1976. And that was basically just unheard of. And that kind of element to me, is just a very well-respected, well-liked couple in town were just brutally murdered. For a senseless crime, it was a bank robbery. He was a banker in Zeeland. And so 3 young men, 2 18-year-olds and a 21-year-old, all with local ties, came, basically kidnapped the couple, took them to the bank, and they only got, I believe, $3,000 or $3,200. And after that, they murdered them, shot them to death with a shotgun. Mm-hmm. And I would say, to answer your question, Jim, it's mostly just the senselessness and the obscure or just very strange that these 3 young men did this and they were, sort of local. One was definitely grew up in Zeeland, and the other 2 had family there, although they technically grew up in California. And then the small town element was also something that just seems so out of place there in 1976 Zeeland, I guess.
Yeah, the obvious parallel, like you said, is with the Truman Capote in Cold Blood. Also things like the Starkweather homicides back in the 50s, where these horrible, heinous things were happening in the middle of the most innocent, innocuous parts of the American heartland.
Exactly, yeah. We're talking everyone in Zeeland, I shouldn't say that, but most people went to church in Zeeland. These are God-fearing, religious people, hardworking farmers in this little quiet area of the world who wake up on July 11th to learn that, 2 prominent members of their community were just strangely kidnapped and killed. It was a very surreal event for the whole state, really. That kind of thing didn't really happen.
Was this a painful thing for you to do the research? Because it sounds like the way you reflected, it sounds like it was kind of an ordeal for you to even read about it.
Well, it didn't actually start out that way. I mean, I started out sort of with a lot of distance, and the more I learned, I became quite obsessed, you might say, with the research. I mean, at one point, I found myself looking up the weather in the state or the town of Prosser, Washington, on February 14th, 1953, just because that's where two of these convicted men who were brothers, where their parents were married that day in the state of Washington. And I was down to the point where I wanted to know what was the weather like when their parents were married. At that point, you're in pretty deep.
Yeah.
And then you start getting into, how should I put this? Well, I should add, I've gotten to know the families of the victims quite well. And you become, it was definitely difficult at times, but also I will say that I always came back to this story needs to be told, and it's the right time now too, because kind of like there was this window of opportunity where enough time had passed, but not so much that there's no one left to tell the story, if that makes sense.
Well, James, how can we find out more about the podcast? Where can we go to get the chapters?
Well, there's a lot of different ways, and people should not feel bad if they don't know what podcasts are. A lot of people still are. It's really just kind of a new phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think people are embarrassed to say they don't know what a podcast is, but they definitely should not be. But there's many ways to listen. But probably the easiest, I would say, if you have access to internet, I mean, you need that at the very minimum, is to, go to my website, which is dakotaspotlight.com. And I've made it very simple there, where, as soon as you get there, you see, listen to episode 1, you click on that, and there's a little play button, looks like a triangle, and you hit that, and as long as your speakers are on your phone or your computer or whatever, you should be able to listen to it. And there are many other ways, with a lot of smartphone apps, you can download podcast apps.
Yeah, I believe the Fargo Forum has it linked as well, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
You can go to the Fargo Forum's website, and they have a page there where all the episodes, or you can play directly from them as well.
And we will also make it accessible on the websites for the town square stations. James Wolner, thanks again for joining us here for this podcast, and drive carefully, sir.
Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it.
Take care. Talk to you soon.